to the second webinar in our Women in Research Small Wins series, and thank you for joining us. We're really excited to be hosting this series. We have some more wonderful laureates to introduce you to, and we also have some oh, actually, sorry, my slides are not going forward. I'm sorry. I will have to get Sana back in here. Sorry, guys. We're just having a few technical issues. Sorry, Sana. It's not actually going forward when I press.
You'll have to control it from there.
Oh, okay. So how do I make? Oh, from there. Okay. Right. Okay. So what we're going to do today is, first of all, I'm just going to very briefly talk a little bit about Women in Research, what it is, and why we're having this notion of small wins. And then I'm going to introduce the topic, which is about staying sane whilst managing homework challenges. And then we will go to our wonderful panel with Professor Jolanda Jetten and Professor Lisa Kewley. And you'll hear some of their personal insights on this topic, and you'll have the opportunity to ask them some questions. Then we'll encourage you to set a little small win for the future. And just by way of housekeeping, we're going to use Slido for questions, and you can see the code there, #WinR. Please, if you can keep your microphones and cameras off just from the bandwidth perspective. Contact using the chat function if there are any problems. And I do encourage you, I know that we all love to multitask and check our emails whilst we're doing presentations, but I would encourage you just to take this hour for yourself, because I think you'll get a lot more out of the session if we do. Very briefly, for those not familiar, the Women in Research initiative is funded as part of my Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow, and specifically the Kathleen Fitzpatrick component of that award. And it basically consists primarily of a website where we've put together, we like to think, both evidence and inspiration. And the evidence is really, we've tried to summarise a lot of research and guidance around managing your career. And you can see from the slide here the topics we cover: managing you, managing your career, mentoring and managing others, gender equality. And then the other side of it is about inspiration. And so we have some fantastic videos and stories from Australian laureates, females, across multiple disciplines, multiple universities. And I really encourage you to check those out if you haven't seen them, because they are very inspirational. We also have surveys that you can use to personally reflect, and lots more. And if you missed webinar 1, you can see that material up there. So here you see the screenshot of the page for managing homework challenges. And you see Jill Bennett there, who's one of our Australian laureates, saying, you know, it wasn't really until she became a mother that she really learnt how to manage her time and be a multitasking academic. So that's the website. Check it out if you're not familiar. Now, this series is all about small wins, and this is this notion of trying to set some small goals, or in the words of BJ Fogg, some tiny habits. And I think last time I introduced the idea of stepping out of your comfort zone, because nobody grows or develops if they stay in their comfort zone. But I encourage you not to step so far out of your comfort zone that you get completely overwhelmed. Today, I just want to share some thoughts from this book, Tiny Habits, which I read very quickly. And here the notion is that sometimes if we want to change our behaviour, if we make it a habit, then what happens when you make things a habit is that you don't need to use your energy and your resources to, it's just ingrained. It's part of what you do every day without really thinking. So the idea is here to try and just change your habits, tiny behaviour by tiny behaviour. And the idea is that tiny is quick. So all of us are time poor. None of us have enough time to, you know, suddenly launch on a big exercise campaign of 2 hours a day or anything like that. But we all might be able to get 5 minutes to do a bit of stretching or whatever. So tiny is fast. Tiny is something you can usually start straight away. It's safe. It's not a big risk or a radical change. but it can grow big. Small habits that accumulate can create big change over time. And what these guys talk about is that tiny habits mean you don't have to rely so much on motivation. And I'm going to give you an example. And by the way, there's a TED talk there by this guy. If you're interested, you can watch it. But what Fogg talks about is this idea that behaviour is a function of motivation, ability and a prompt. And by the way, that's not Fogg's model. That's actually a very old model in psychology. But Fogg has taken it and adapted it. So if you can see that little slide that I've shown there, what that shows, you can see the action line is a combination of motivation and ability. So for example, if you are a mother and you are protecting a child from a bear, that would be a very hard thing to do, right? It would be very tough to wrestle with a bear to protect your child. So you can see it's at the hard to do end of the spectrum, but it's over the action line. It's something you would do because your motivation would be incredibly high. So you see how your action is a combination of ability and motivation. Now let's look at a bad habit, and I have this bad habit. I hope other people do not, but one of my bad habits is that when my alarm goes off, which is on my phone, I can very quickly start picking up my phone and then start, checking out LinkedIn and doing a little bit of Facebook and doing some Twitter and checking the news. And before you know it, the hour that I was hoping to get up and do some exercise has gone by, and all I've done is lie in my bed and engage in social media. And what you can see here is that this bad habit is really easy to do because my phone is literally right there. So you can see the easy to do component, but it's also motivating. It's actually quite reinforcing and comfortable to stay in bed and check out what's happening in the world with my friends and so on. So it's something that happens. And if we want to change that habit, we either need to change that motivation or the ability. And so if we want to create a tiny habit or stop a bad habit, so let's focus on stopping a bad habit. First thing we need to do is remove any prompts for the behaviour. So you see that with my example of the alarm going off on my phone, that's the prompt for the behaviour. So maybe what I need to do is actually have an alarm that's not a phone. That would then remove that prompt of, oh, I've picked up my phone to turn off the alarm and wow, suddenly social media is right there and really easy to access. So remove, first of all, those prompts for the negative behaviours and then make the behaviour harder to do. So it's actually probably in this case quite hard to change a motivation because it's quite pleasurable and nice looking at social media, in some senses more pleasurable than getting up and doing exercise. But if I put my phone in the kitchen at night so that in the morning I had to actually get up and go and get my phone to start doing social media, it would be that much harder to do that I wouldn't hopefully actually do it. So that's step two. So what you see here is at the moment it's really easy to engage in this bad habit. What we're suggesting is making it harder to do. The motivation's still there, but we're making it much harder to do. And of course you can think of ways to reduce your motivation, but remember I suggested this particular technique is not so much about changing your motivation, it's more about making things easy to do or hard to do and about removing prompts for those behaviours. Now of course if you want to create a positive habit, you would reverse these ideas. So you would put in place prompts for the behaviour. So if you're trying to go jogging every morning, you put your shoes literally by your bed so that you pretty much step on them when you get out of the bed. You would make the behaviour really easy to do. So you would have all your jogging clothes all ready so that you don't have to think, you can just get up and put them straight on. Or if you're like me, you schedule a class because that's a way that it's really easy for me to go. And then, of course, think of ways to reduce your motivation. So that's a little bit more on tiny habits. And I want you to think about a tiny habit you might put in place for managing your work-home challenges a little bit more. Last time we talked about mental health in the workplace, and we actually just asked you all a question. If you've experienced stress or burnout during COVID, why? And isn't it interesting how strongly workload, work-life balance is up there. And so today we're really going to zero in on this work-life balance question. And in our Women in Research survey, and thank you very much for those of you who participated in that, we had several hundred women do it. More than half of you agree or strongly agree that, you know, things that you want to do at home just do not get done because of the demands that your work puts on you. And that's just one of our items. We have quite a few items, and they all suggest that work-home conflict is really quite high for women in research. And actually we find that it's even higher if you're part-time. So you can see that bottom figure there, the same question, 63% of part-time women are agreeing with that or strongly agreeing, compared to 40% of full-time women. We also found the highest levels of homework conflict between levels B and D, which is sort of interesting. I think those are years where it's really critical to be productive. I also think often that's when people will have small children or new relationships and so on. And so those categories experience the highest level of work-home conflict. And just to remind you, we did find quite high levels of psychological distress for this group of women, and work-home conflict was one of the biggest predictors of those mental health outcomes. So this is a really important topic. And what I'm going to share with you is I'm going to share with you research, 3 pieces of research basically. And the first is a meta-analysis. So many of your researchers will know what a meta-analysis is. And that's when you take the results of original studies and you analyse those original studies collectively. So this is a meta-analysis of work-family conflict based on 178 original studies. Now that's quite small writing, so I'll leave that slide there for you on the pack so you can look at that in more detail. It actually summarises the meta-analysis for work to family conflict and family to work conflict. But what I just want to talk through is I'm just going to pick one of those in the interest of time, and I'm going to pick family to work conflict. And what family to work conflict is about, it's about when your work is hard to do because of family or home related matters interfering. And the other side of it is work to family conflict, which is when your work makes your family life more difficult. So you can go back and look at the results. But in fact, there are some quite common predictors. So that meta-analysis, so this is just a blown up picture of that meta-analysis, has identified these factors as the strongest predictors of family to work conflict. So your work being hard to do because of family challenges. So I'm going to just go through those fairly quickly. But also suggest to you how you can use this information. So thinking about what you can change, what is in your sphere of influence. So the first category is aspects of the job. So it will not surprise you that high workload, high ambiguity, so that means you're not really sure what it is you should be doing in your work, or high work role conflict, which is when you've got sort of conflicting expectations. And I think as academics, we very often have a conflicting expectation between research and teaching, and sometimes citizenship as well. They're all things we're meant to do, but they pull us in different directions. If you've got those sort of stressors, you're much more likely to experience homework conflict. If you've got autonomy, so the things in green we sort of want more of, if you've got autonomy, that's a protective factor. So, and we'll talk more about that later, but if you've got autonomy in your work, that means you can influence things like when you work, where you work, how you work. That actually means you're likely to have less homework conflict. And support from peers, and you can see the numbers there indicate the sort of size of the effect. Support from peers and support from supervisors is really important. Protective factor for work-home conflict. So my suggestion to you is, can you reduce your job demands? Can you negotiate a lower teaching load? Can you be less perfectionist about some things you do? Can you collaborate more so that you're having to, do less single author papers and so on? So how can you reduce the demands in your job? Can you negotiate and craft more autonomy if you currently don't have much? Can you go and talk to your supervisor about more flexibility in hours, for example? And perhaps most importantly, can you build your support network What are you doing to make sure you've got support from peers and your supervisor? Because we know that that's very protective. Now, the second factor, set of factors is really more about your organisation and what your organisation does to provide support for being family friendly. And this is things like allowing flexible working, having decent maternity leave, taking account of having children in promotion pathways and so on, all these sorts of things. Now, this is a tricky one because if you haven't got those things in your organisation, sometimes it can be very hard to shape and influence that. You could lobby, advocate, give ideas if you've got some influence in your organisation, and if you don't, maybe it's really saying, is this the right organisation for you? The next category is more aspects of you. And we find, unsurprisingly, that if you're really involved in your work, you tend to have more family to work conflict because your work is important to you. High internal locus of control is a protective factor. So if you're someone who feels that you can influence things and you've got this sense of, you know, I can make a difference to my world, you're going to engage in more what we call problem-focused coping. And so that actually is protective of this demand. Interestingly, you can see there that we call it high negative affect or neuroticism. If you are someone who worries a lot, gets anxious a lot, you can see that that is going to impact on your level of homework conflict. So, you know, what can you do about that? Well, you know, can you change your thinking patterns? And that's really, you're probably going to need some help if this is the way you've always thought and you've always been anxious and worried. You know, maybe you'll need the help of a coach or a counsellor. But maybe you can adopt a more problem-focused approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then finally, aspects of the family matter, and this is sort of, again, obvious. You know, the demands that you've got in terms of housekeeping or partner, you know, traveling a lot or whatever, these things really make a difference for your level of family to work conflict. So can you reduce those demands? What can you outsource? What just doesn't matter? You know, can you actually be less worried about certain aspects of your household? And can you get your partner or spouse to take on more? Family climate is important, and this is about if you've got a family that sort of understands the importance of sharing and flexibility, can you create a more positive family climate in your family? So that's those are sort of probably the sort of strategies that are going to address family to work conflict, and you'll get some more specific tips from the laureates on some of these sort of things a little bit later. I just want to also touch on the second piece of research is really about home work conflict during COVID. And a nice study has very recently come out in one of the premier journals in our field, the Journal of Applied Psychology. And this was, it's an American sample, but what they looked at, they had some data on women and their experiences pre-COVID, and then they looked at what happened post-COVID, and they found that there were a group of women for whom this transition was negative and increased people's work-home conflict and reduced their enrichment, which is that sort of positive spillover, because sometimes we get positive spillover from work to family and family to work. So these people who experienced these negative transitions during COVID, and you might be one of them, in other words, where things got worse as a result of COVID, had lower satisfaction, lower performance, and higher turnover in tension. What's interesting, though, is who was more likely to experience these negative transitions. And first of all, we found that, or not we, this study found that people with high segmentation preferences were more likely to have negative transitions. So these are people who like to keep their work separate from their home life. And there is actually a sort of preference. Some people prefer to keep things separate. Some people prefer to integrate things. But the people who prefer to keep them separate, unsurprisingly perhaps, really suffered when they had to work from home during COVID because everything got blurred together. Also, people who are emotion focused in terms of how they cope with stresses we're more likely to have these negative transitions. A more positive style of coping is to really attack the problem and solve the problem. So if you're struggling, actually trying to figure out, well, how can I solve the problem? Whereas an emotion-focused approach is more, you know, you might sort of just think about, how can I feel better about this, and fantasize or just dwell on your emotions and so on. And that's a more passive way of coping and not so helpful. Perhaps unsurprisingly, people having lots of technological hassles had more negative transitions. And interestingly, for those of you who are managers of people, if you have less compassionate supervisors, then you're more likely to have these negative transitions. So as a supervisor, one of the ways that we can help with events like the COVID and people having to work from home is to be more compassionate. And we talked about self-compassion in the last webinar. This is really about compassion towards other people. The third area of research I'm just going to very quickly touch on is this notion of boundary management. So I mentioned already that some people prefer to keep their work quite separate from their family. So, you know, maybe they don't have many photos of their family or their home life in their work office. They don't perhaps make appointments for doctors and things like that during work. They keep things separate. And then there are other people who really integrate. And on the one hand, they might take some work home to do. On the other hand, they might book some appointments for their kids' dentist, you know, during work hours. So, and they are more integrators. So there's been a lot of research on which is best. Is it better to be a segmenter, or is it better to be an integrator? And actually the research, as it always does, shows that that's actually a bit of an oversimplified question. And there are actually some nuances that we need to take into account. So as I talk through these three questions, just have a little think for yourself. What sort of preferences and situation are you in? So are you an integrator? And if you're an integrator, do you integrate both ways? So do you allow your non-work things to interrupt your work? And do you allow your work to interrupt your non-work? So some people might just be an integrator in one way. So for example, I probably personally tend to more allow my work to interrupt my non-work than I do allow my family to interrupt my work. So I sort of probably just have that integration a little bit one way. So that's the first question. Or are you someone who likes to really keep things separate? So you're a bit more of a segmenter. Second question is how much control do you have? So I mentioned before the importance of autonomy. How much autonomy do you have about how you manage your boundaries between home and so can you choose when you work, where you work? Can you go for a dental appointment in the middle of a day if you want and pick up the time later? Or actually, you know, are you running a lab and you have to be there at specific times and you really can't allow work to interfere, home to interfere with your work? So how much control do you have? And then finally, what's important to you? Because some people, for family is everything and the most important thing. Some people, work is everything and the most important thing. And of course, some people it's both. And then there are some people for whom it's other things altogether, you know, sport or something else. So what's really important to you? So these guys, Kosek et al., and you see them down the bottom, they use these to identify some common boundary manager profiles. And I'm just going to ask you, as I talk through these, to think about which profile are you most like. And if you can put your answer on Slido, Jess will then show people's different answers. So the first two are people who have low boundary control. So these are people who can't really choose how they manage their homework boundaries. And so the first is, and in this sample it was about 9%, are work warriors. So these are people for whom work is really important and they really have that integration only one way. So they allow their work to interrupt their non-work, but they're not necessarily allowing the reverse. And these are very work-focused sorts of people. So that's one type. The next type is overwhelmed reactors. So these are people for whom work and family is really important. Both are important. And they allow those interruptions both ways. but they don't really have much control. So I can imagine that might be a bit stressful. So you can't really manage your boundaries very well, but you would like to have those interruptions both ways. The next one is family guardians. So these next four, they're all cases, and I think a lot of academics do tend to have quite a bit of boundary control. Not all, because some are in labs or in postdoc positions or something where you don't, but most often academics tend to have quite a bit of boundary control. And we see here four types. We see, first of all, family guardians, and these are people who have a high work and family identity, but they really have the integration in terms of allow their family to interrupt their work, but not the other way. So they will go to their kids' sporting activities or whatever, but they're not necessarily taking work home and so on. So these are real family guardians. Next, we have fusion lovers. So these are very, again, strong on work and family identity, and they're allowing that interruption both ways. So, you know, dental appointment at work, but also probably taking work home. So those fusion lovers, loving to integrate, because you've got the choice and that's what they're choosing to do. And then we have the opposite. We have people who are high on boundary control and they've got that high identity, but they are really keeping things very separate. So very low interruptions from work to family and vice versa. And they are dividers, so keeping things separate. And then finally, we have these non-work eclectics, and these are people for whom work or family are not particularly important, but there are other things in their life that are important. Now, you may not fit into one of those categories because the statistical technique used here was to identify the most common ones. But if you do identify into one of those categories, pop it into Slido, and Jess is going to share with you people's responses. If you think that none of them really fit, just pop in other, and we'll do a little bit of research here. Now, I just want to note while you're doing that, actually, if you look at who is faring psychologically positively, the people with that low boundary control, the work warriors and the overwhelmed reactors, tend to have the highest distress, the highest intention to quit, and the highest level of conflict between family and work. The ones that are most thriving, interestingly, are the family guardians. So that the family guardians have lowest levels of distress and conflict. They also tend to be a bit less engaged in their work, which makes sense given their family focus. But the dividers also have very positive outcomes. If you're a fusion lover, which I think I probably am, or a non-work eclectic, doesn't mean that you have bad outcomes. You're just not perhaps as positive as those other two groups. So what really matters, what this research shows, is having that boundary control. So I said before that autonomy is protective. And what this research shows is that you can integrate, you can be an integrator, or you can be a segmenter. And both of those strategies work if that's what you want to do, and if you've got the control in your work to be able to line up or have congruent between the environment or your work and your preferred situation. So I'm going to now stop sharing my screen, and we're going to see if Jess can share her screen and see what sorts of categories everyone is in, and then we're going to go very soon to our panel. So Jess, are you able to share your screen there?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had about 40 people put in their boundary control type at the moment. Let me just try and share my screen. Oh. One of them here now.
Yep, that's coming. Oh, yep. Interesting.
So we can see we've got a lot of fusion lovers, but we also have quite a few overwhelmed reactors as well.
That's interesting. Yeah, and some dividers too. And I think dividers. Yeah. So this is interesting. So it'll be interesting to hear from Lisa and Jolanda, you know, where they fit and how they've made their strategy work. Thanks, Jess. I'm going to go back to sharing my content, if you don't mind.
Yep. There you go.
Thank you very much. And so that was over to you, Jess. just to very briefly summarise some of those points that I have made, most women in research are experiencing this conflict between home and work. And we can really, in a nutshell, we can either change the situation, so we can reduce the demands and the stressors either in our work or our family, or we can increase the supports in the family or in our work. And particularly that autonomy and boundary control is important. Or we can try to change ourselves, or we can do both, of course. So we can try to change how we manage the boundaries, and we can change how we solve problems. And those are some pathways towards achieving better homework balance. So I'm just going to end before I hand over to our speakers. I just want to make the point that it's really not easy to do this. And I'm sharing with you a little, one of my teenage daughters is really into note writing, and she often writes little thank you notes and how much she loves your notes. But this was not a sorry card from my daughter. And you can read the little letter she wrote, you know, that she's really ashamed with me right now. Been going out for an evening for 15 days straight. I can't believe that was ever true. But anyway, I promised to go late night shopping, but I didn't. She says, you've been out of focus for a long time. It's actually really rude. She says, you're going to Melbourne for an unnecessary work trip again. But then she says down the bottom, but I still love you. And I guess I'm just sharing this little note from my daughter to say it is not easy to get these balances right. And our kids sometimes do suffer, but they still love us. So I'm now going to introduce our two wonderful laureates who are going to share some of their insights. And first up, we're going to have Laureate Fellow Jolanda Jetten from the University of Queensland, who is a professor of psychology. And second up, we will have Professor Lisa Kewley, who is an ARC Laureate Fellow and also a director of a Centre of Excellence in Astrophysics. So very different professions, and really very much looking forward to hearing from the both of you about your personal experiences with managing homework conflicts. So Jolanda, we will go to you first of all.
Thank you, Sharon. I love that note, by the way. I had a few of those myself. So thank you for having me. And I thought you had a few questions. I'll go through them. And if I go for too long, just cut me off, right?
Sure.
So maybe first sort of bit of an idea of where I stand in terms of homework balance. I actually asked my husband, because homework balance is much better than mine, and he will be probably a good person to ask. And he said to me, he said, oh, it's not too bad. Could be better, but it's not too bad. So, and I think maybe do that too. Ask someone, preferably someone who has a better homework balance than you have. Ask them what they actually see when they look at you. So as a bit of background, I have two daughters who are now 19 and 21. I had them when I was a postdoc here at UQ, and then when they were very young, we moved as a family to England, to Exeter, and I took up my lecturing job. So the youngest was only 6 months old, the eldest 2 years. And I remember it was tough. It was incredibly tough, especially as a postdoc. I had a lot of boundary control, which you were talking about, Sharon. And that was definitely sort of a bit of a shock to the system when I had to start lecturing, all sorts of admin roles, and have to be available. So that's ever since it's gotten much better, especially after being back on research only positions where you have that boundary control back. So just one other question that Sharon had was, knowing what you now know, is there anything you would do differently as a junior researcher to manage home and work? And I think maybe my answer to that is probably I wouldn't do anything much differently in terms of behavior, but I would certainly think differently about it. So I would be much more relaxed. about taking time off, spending an afternoon with the kids in the playground rather than being at work, I would drop the guilt. And that is something that I think is incredibly important. Academia is one of those few jobs where we have a lot of freedom in how we work, but also I believe one of the few jobs where people don't take that freedom to really devise the day and do it the way that they want to do it. So there's a lot of guilt that prevents us from making the most of that freedom that we often have. Not everyone, but a lot of us do. And the other issue that I would probably do differently is that I would talk more to others about work-home balance. I think there is certainly in academia still this idea of, we glorify long hours. It's all about sacrifice. And if you want to be taken serious, well, then don't complain about how tough you're going. So it's still too much, I think, a bit of we see it as a sign of weakness if we say that we're struggling and we're worried what others might think of us, in particular if you still have to go for promotion. But now looking back on all of that, I would probably talk more to others, because what I've learned over the years is that we're all in this together. We're all having exactly the same issues, and just talking through it and these little micro tips are so incredibly important for your mental health. So then in terms of quickly some points of advice, I have a few. I have 6 actually. I'll just try and go through them. My first recommendation would be not trying to be superhuman. And I was thinking about that some people, my postdoc actually asked me a while ago, how can I actually still be productive at night? And I looked at her more like, well, you can't, you're tired. And when you're tired, then do something else. You can't work, and you need to accept that. No one is able to do that. And if you go on a holiday, make sure that you actually have a proper break. Don't open your emails. And just really make a point of that. I think people often respect you for that, and there's certain things that you can do. So in particular, I guess, because it's really about this is I believe, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. We really have to watch that we're not getting exhausted. You need to stay sane in the long term. But another issue is still that I think we also need to sometimes rethink work-home balance. We still see it very much as how much of our time, how much of our work life do we actually let eat into our evenings and into our weekends. And what I try to do for myself is very much like, look, 40 hours, that's something that I'm committed to. But after that, it becomes tough negotiating. And I think be strict about that. Then more for people who are thinking of having kids. I found it really interesting what someone said at a workshop that I once attended. So going round about, well, how can you actually make it in academia as a female? A lot of people brought up, well, it's all about whether you have kids or not. And the moderator actually said, it's not about that. It's about who you are having kids with. And I guess that was particularly true for me. We raised our kids outside of, we were just 2 of us. There was no family nearby. So you really have to have a good plan in place. I mean, we know how to collaborate with others at work, but actually it's your partner that you have to really have very good sort of collaborative structure with, and be very clear about how you're actually going to do this together. For me, it was always like, my condition for having kids was it needs to be a 50-50 deal. My husband was very good in sort of, living up to that. But at times I also have to say he did much more at times, and other times I did more. So you have to have that flexibility, and that's incredibly important. That was incredibly important for me, at least. 2 more tips. One is that for me, it's incredibly important to have friends outside of academia. I go walking on a Saturday morning with 2 of my friends who are non-academics. And it's important, not just because they give me a little bit of, they really take me outside of my role as an academic, then suddenly I'm a different person. It's a reset button, and my weekend starts, really, I think, I'm in a different role, and that's very important. But also, as academics, we accept that we go over the 40 hours, and people in other sort of fields of work, they don't. And sometimes it's good to actually listen to them, and to that works for me, at least. And then the final issue is, I think work-home life balance is a daily issue. It's indeed something that every day I'm trying to make, think about. I think about it an awful lot, and I think it's an important question to get it right. I liked your point about these tiny habits, Sharon. I think that's indeed exactly what it's all about. We have so many moments a day that we have to make decisions about what we're giving priority. And it's important to think those through rather than to just put them to the side. And so that's for me. Thank you.
Just unmute. Thank you so much, Jolanda. I like what you've really highlighted there. You had lots of great tips, but particularly the power of support. And you've talked about support in terms of sharing with other people some of the challenges, friends outside of academia, and also partner or spousal support, and the importance of choosing the right person, plus some other fantastic tips. Jess, do we have one question for Jolanda before we move to Lisa?
Sure. We haven't had any Q&A through Slido as of yet, so if you are a guest joining us today, I would really encourage you to pop over to Slido to put in your questions. But one that we had come through in the sort of prepared questions, when it comes to home and work challenges, how can you communicate these challenges to line managers and colleagues in an effective way?
I think that's incredibly important, and I'm very glad that a lot of people that I work with now, that they are actually doing that. But I also believe it's a two-way street here. So you also, as a supervisor, have to make clear that you're open to that type of question, and that is something that I find interesting, that people are very reluctant to ask questions, for instance, about, how do I manage kids? Should I get kids? Or all of those big questions in life that they're very reluctant to ask them their supervisor. And for me, it's the other way around. I love to talk about those things because they are the bigger issues. They are the really important issues. So I would encourage everyone to just really raise them, because you're thinking it and everyone else in the room is thinking about those issues. And it's only in that way that you can also create cultures where these things are being openly discussed, and that is beneficial for all.
Thank you so much, Jolanda. So Lisa, can I invite you to now, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of your thoughts? That was brilliant, Jolanda. So we hear from Lisa, have a question for Lisa, and then we'll have some broader questions.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Yes, so I have two children, they're 9 and 12, and I had my son while I was on the tenure track, so sort of effectively level C, I guess, while I was in the US, and it was a challenging time. Where I was based at the University of Hawaii, there wasn't any maternity leave. It just wasn't a thing in the university, so I had to apply for sick leave to look after my son. And of course, you can only get sick leave for limited periods of time. There's basically nothing like a year maternity leave over there. So I went back to work after 3 months having my son, and then I basically worked part-time until he was 6 months. I had my daughter 2 years later, and that was even more challenging because she didn't take the bottle, and so I was basically going back to work and then rushing home to feed her and then going back in, or having my husband do that if he was able to bring her. He would bring her into me to feed. And so I moved back to Australia when my daughter was 6 months old and my son was 3, and began work at the ANU. I had both kids. I didn't want to lose my international profile. I had a strong international profile in astrophysics, and that was mostly due to the fact that I did travel, and I went to conferences and I gave talks and I gave colloquia at universities, and I almost never said no to any international travel. So one of the things I did decide to do after having children was to keep traveling, and I would bring the children with me. I breastfed them both for 2 years each, and so I just bring them with me, and often by myself because my husband would be working. So I remember I went to the American Astronomical Society meeting, and I was giving a sort of a plenary lecture, and I was more nervous about taking my son on the plane. It was his first time on the plane and my first time traveling with him alone, and whether he would sleep that night so I could give my talk the next day after having, you know, would I have sleep before my talk or not? And fortunately, what I did was, before traveling with my kids, I looked up what women in business do. So there weren't that many women in astronomy with children, but there were some. I emailed those women in astronomy with children and asked them how they managed conferences, how they managed work and family life. And I also looked up online information about how business women handled having children and managing businesses, or you know, women who are CEOs. I looked up that, and the information I got from the women in business was particularly useful, and it said that they keep traveling, and that you can hire babysitters anywhere through hotels usually, but there are also companies, and that there are these companies that will come to your hotel and set up baby equipment for you before you arrive. And so I started using those services. And so I'd have the babysitter lined up, and then I'd have the equipment set up in the room. So I only had to travel with the baby, and there would be a swing and all, you know, toys in the bathtub, whatever it is they needed, all set up in the room. And that helped considerably. And so I just had to bring the baby to, you know, meeting dinners, and you know, sometimes I brought the baby into the building, and I just asked for a separate room for the babysitter to go, so that I could feed the child, and mostly they accepted. And actually I think they were glad that I was able to keep up my commitment, you know, while being around the children. And I preferred being able to spend the time with the children rather than away from them. And I felt that, you know, the kids were seeing more of me than they would have had I been away for the week, and they were certainly seeing a lot more of me. And but my research time was really suffering. So, you know, because I had all these committees, there was teaching, and then I was trying to juggle the family life as well. It took me a little while to work out the balance that I was comfortable with, family versus work. And I'm a real divider. So I have work, and I solidly work during my work hours, and I have home, and I solidly do home stuff in my home hours, and I tend not to mix them. And so working out the number of hours for work and the number of hours I was going to spend at home, and also the amount of time I was comfortable with spending away from my kids once they're older. You know, once they're in school, I can't take them out of school to go on trips with me, maybe only a couple of times a year. And so I just had to think about it, and I thought 15% is what I'm comfortable with, and I'm not comfortable being away from them more than 15% of the year. And so then I would work out what conferences I preferred to go to. I'd have to prioritize, and then I'd have to say no to some, but at least I could still do some. Now, while my research was suffering, there was something that really changed my life, and that was going to an academic women's rights by Beth Beckman. I think she's a guest maybe. This actually really changed my life, because it taught me about time management, and to look at how I was managing my time in a totally different way than I'd been doing. So there was a speaker there who talked about the urgent important matrix, and I put you know, everything I was doing on the urgent important matrix, and realized that I was tackling the things that are urgent but not necessarily important as high priority, and I wasn't prioritizing my research on my own writing for myself. I started doing schedules. So first I did a schedule. I actually just wrote a schedule, my optimal schedule for the week. Here's my schedule for the week. And then things would come up and change, especially once I started managing my Centre of Excellence, which has 250 people. So I spent a lot of time doing management. I realized that so much of my schedule was being changed. And so I started looking at my actual schedule. So at the end of each day, I'd write what actually happened. What did I do in every hour of the day? And then I'd compare that with what I was planning on doing due that day. And I did it for about 3 weeks. And so I had, and once I compared my actual schedule compared with my planned schedule, I noticed that the things that were taking up all my research time were Astro 3D things. And, you know, Centre of Excellence, it was committees, and it was additional things that popped up, urgent things. You know, people come and I'm dealing with personnel issues and things like that. So I started delegating more, much more, to the point where almost everything is delegated now. I do really strict time management at work. So I have a schedule and I stick to it, and I have back-to-back meetings on 3 days a week. And then the other 3 days I tell everybody I'm actually busy. And if anybody tries to schedule a meeting, it might even be an executive meeting or, you know, something, is if the doodle poll comes out, I just put not available, even though I'm actually completely free. And that means, and it's because I need to set aside that time for working on research and writing. Now, writing retreats, going on a 1 week long trip away, has been instrumental in allowing me to keep writing first author papers while managing family and the Centre of Excellence, and then doing my own research. I now bring my research group on writing retreats about twice a year, and we're actually running them all across the centre. It makes people tremendously productive in terms of writing. People look forward to the retreats. It's a really great way to get your writing done, especially if you do it right before Christmas, and you can feel really good about having achieved something at the end of the year. So I really recommend those. It's a different way of writing to what I had done in the past, and it really opened my eyes to the fact that I could still achieve my own research goals in addition to having all these other responsibilities.
Thank you, Lisa. I think we're going to have to start winding up a little bit, but that was absolutely fantastic. And I'm really interested to hear you saying you're a divider, because interestingly, your conference strategy of taking the kids was really an integration strategy. Yeah, so it sounds like a bit of both, actually. It's
yeah, I think more then. Now I'm much more of a divider, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so funny, because I think
bring the kids to the writing retreats, but I have babysitters, so they're not in there while I'm writing, right? They're still
yeah, that's great. Jess, do we have a question for Lisa?
Yes, we had a few come through on Slido. Thank you so much, everyone. The first question we had was, out of all you can do or you're asked to do as part of your academic role, what are the top 3 that you would drop to enhance your work-life balance?
An easy question for you, Lisa.
Yeah. I'd probably drop the administration. So the paperwork that we have to do, I think there's a lot of non-essential paperwork that we have to do for the research office, for, you know, sort of yes, no type things that we have to do approvals of. I think I definitely dropped the admin stuff first. Next, I guess I'd probably drop some of the committee meetings. I have to say I have delegated a lot of the committee meetings, so I don't do so much that I don't have to, but that. And the other thing I guess is, you know, refereeing papers and refereeing proposals, that sort of thing is a thankless task. And if you're really time limited, I think it's much more important to spend time with your family than doing those things. There are people who are available to do all those things who don't have, you know, some children at home. They've maybe grown up, or they don't choose not to have children in the first place, whatever. But there's plenty of other people who can do those jobs equally as well as you.
I think that's a great comment, Jolanda, because also these things change over time, right? Just because you choose for a particular time not to do referencing doesn't mean you're never going to do it again. But when you've got small children, absolutely, let someone else do it. Jolanda, did you have any comment there about what you would recommend for people to drop?
Well, I believe it's, I was also thinking admin. Admin, there's way too much of it. So try and, and try in all sorts of ways, protect your research, because, you know, that's ultimately, well, at least for me, that was always a bit where I was, what I really wanted to do.
Great, Jess, I think we've got time for a couple more questions, maybe one. Let's go for it.
Sure. There's a couple of sort of COVID-19 related ones. So firstly, to the panel, the question is, now that I am working from home, my kids feel that my kids feel like my attention is diverted, since I wouldn't bring work home before COVID-19. So any tips on handling this? So there's been a bit of a change between bringing work home now that COVID-19 is happening and working from home, whereas previously that wasn't happening. So the person sort of asking, now that I am having to work from home, how do I manage this with my kids?
Yeah, maybe I'm happy to speak to that. I mean, for me, I mean, with my daughters being adults, that's less of an issue, and I didn't have to do the schooling, and also I didn't have to teach. So the two important predictors in academia, how you actually fared the last couple of months, I'm really sort of fortunate in that respect. But of course, it has really, you know, there are no more boundaries now, and I struggled with that myself too. Sorry, just one more issue that I did want to mention there. Actually, I came across some research where they were actually comparing men now and females and males during COVID. And, you know, both of them are actually seeing, okay, we got kids now and you need to spend time with them much more during school hours and all these other responsibilities. One of the issues there, again, though, was that women felt much more guilty for working, and the kid are actually in the other room either doing the homework or playing or whatever. So for them, it's still, I think that there are some certain notions about being a good mother, and you know, and so that really brings it to the fore, COVID, that yeah, you do have to do your work, at the same time you want to be a parent. And for men there was less of at least, you know, in terms of guilt, they had less guilt about you know, yes, I'm now have to work, and you just go out there and play. And I think that, of course, is really sort of mentally is pretty draining, and it's hard.
And I think this is a case of trying to create those boundaries. You know, we talked before about boundary management, and if you are working from home and your kids are interrupting, it is about trying to physically separate through time when you work, and it depends, of course, on the age of your kids. If they're old enough to threaten and bribe, you know, I would encourage that. Yeah, I think it's just also one of those times you have to accept it's really tough and not beat yourself up too much about it too, I think. Lisa, do you have a comment on that question? And then we'll wrap up, Jess, I think.
I think we're out of time, are we? Or do you want to go longer? I guess I'd be happy to answer questions on email. If anybody like to send me an email, you can just Google me. I'm at ANU. That might be the best way to go for the question. Yeah,
okay. Well, we'll wrap up now, guys. I think last time I promised to answer questions on Facebook and then didn't. This time I really promised to answer questions that you put on Facebook. I'm sorry, I didn't figure out how to do it last time. But guys, I would like at this point to remind you to set yourself a little goal, a small thing you might do. It might be picking up on one of Jolanda's tips about talk to a colleague. It might be as simple as, you know, talk to a colleague every day about and share some of your ideas. Or it might be put in place Lisa's great suggestions about time management. And by the way, on the Women in Research website, if you go to time management, you'll see that exact matrix that Lisa was talking about. So put your, think of a tiny habit, and we'll review how you're going on it next time. We have another session on being resilient coming up, so you can register now via the chat if you like. I titled this talk Staying Sane Whilst Managing Homework challenges. I'm thinking sanity is probably a cozy lie when it comes to managing homework challenges. And on that note, I really just would like to thank all the people who've been involved today, but most especially Lisa and Jolanda, who are super busy, but it's been absolutely terrific to have your insights. And thank you all for coming on board. We look forward to seeing some chat later on Facebook. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sharon.
Yeah, thanks very much.